Our speaker is Sara Tangren. She's been in the area a long time, has grown native plants, done all kinds of great stuff. She's a practitioner, researcher, and educator who has worked with the flora of the Mid-Atlantic region for more than 30 years. Sara has worked as an environmental consultant, a native plant and seed producer, an extension agent, and an invasive plant manager. She has conducted research on her state's rare sundial lupine populations and on the commercial availability of native plants and seeds in the eastern United States. She recently served a 2-year term as coordinator for the National Capital Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. They're called PRISMs. There's a bunch of them. She has degrees in geology, marine science, and natural resources. And her talk tonight is Our Native Plants Warming to a Changing Climate, Potential Effects of Climate Change on Maryland's Native Plants. And she'll talk about how actions we can take to address the issue. All right, I think that's it. Take it away, Sara.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this topic. It's not something I've done professionally, so I've spent the last several weeks just reading journal articles and journal articles and journal articles. So on a personal note, I've spent the last several weeks reading about climate change, and I'm feeling a little depressed. But I also found some things in there that were good news. So it's not all bad. So let's dig in. I do want to put a little bit of context on this. So we will have just a few slides about the actual climate change issues before we begin talking about native plants. So the projections for what our climate is going to be like in the future, these are from the International Panel for Climate Change. And we have a lot of these slides will have a QR code on it. Like I said, I've spent weeks reading about climate change, and in all of that, there were certain references that were just the best. And if I have one of these references, I'm going to put that QR code there in case you want to read it too. I think most of you probably know you point your phone camera and that will take you to the website. So fossil fuels are the leading contributing factor, and our fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase every year if you look at the global picture. That is distressing. The piece of good news I found in there that I actually wasn't aware of, like I said, I don't do this professionally, is that the greenhouse gas emissions for the United States have been dropping every year since 2011. And the drop is substantial. It's not enough to, solve the problem. We're not down to 50% or zero, net neutral or anything like that. But I find cause for hope in that statistic. The NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, has an absolutely excellent publication specific to the state of Maryland, and they just updated it in 2022. So it's pretty good stuff. Our temperatures are already up 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the year 1900. And on what they call a low emissions trajectory, we can expect an additional 2.5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. So maybe 5, like if we land in the middle of that. And in the high emissions trajectory, it could be as high as 13. And it's not just about temperature. We have more storms, more intense storms. Our region in particular is expected to have more droughts than it used to. And as you know, droughts are super stressful on plants, but the droughts are more likely to come in the summer when it's going to be hotter out than it used to be. So from a plant perspective, right when the plants have the greatest water demand, it's going to be hotter than usual and the soil is going to be dry. And so it isn't just a story about temperature. There are some other things going on. In terms of invasive species, several studies have now shown that invasive species are likely to be even more of a pain in the butt with the higher temperatures and the higher CO2 concentrations and the elongated growing seasons. The International Panel for Climate Change has species loss models, and these loss models are actually for animals and seagrasses. The report's 1,000 pages long. I don't know why they were like, let's use animals and seagrasses. But if we can use this as a proxy for plant species lost, a ballpark for that, this would be their map. And in the upper left, we have the low emission scenario, and in the lower right, we have the worst case scenario. And if you're like me and you don't like use the metric system for your weather reports and stuff, I find it very helpful to just get a rough idea what 4 degrees Celsius or centigrade means. I just multiply it by 2. It's about 8. It's good enough for reading graphs that are ballparking numbers like this. So something like 8 degrees Fahrenheit increase. Now, so species loss, you can tell from the color scale. And I know the numbers are hard to read. And I was gobsmacked by this when I read the numbers on this scale. So this pale gold that you see up here in the upper left, and you see a little bit of that color around our part of North America, that represents 0.1 to 1% species loss. Down here in the lower right, the brown that you see represents 10 to 20% species loss. So, in a worst case scenario, maybe we're looking at something like that. This is all an estimate, right? What really freaks me out is that purple band that's going around the equator. And so the first time I'm looking at this, I'm like, oh, well, I could have expected that it would be worse around the equator. They're going to lose more. That purple represents 100%. So sometimes I just don't even know what to say when I'm reading this stuff, right? I don't even know what to think. It's like my car is a traffic jam and all the cars are just like crashing into each other. So we also have production for grain and not a biodiversity issue, but a people-related issue. Production of grain in the high emissions scenario at lower right. The dark purple on this graph represents 35% loss in the capacity, essentially, to feed people. And heat stroke is what you might think. Basically, this graph means that the graph on the lower right, that's the high emissions scenario. In all of those purple areas, there will be 300 to 365 days a year where the combination of heat and humidity are a threat to human life. So uninhabitable, right? And so the reason I bring that up in a native plant context is that normally when you're planning for something like a battle, right? You're going into battle. How are we going to save plant biodiversity? You would normally say, okay, if our battle plan doesn't work, if we lose the first battle, what's our fallback position for the rest of the war? There's no rest of this war. If we don't do this, if we don't combat climate change successfully, more successfully than the worst case scenario, which our emissions are currently on track for that scenario, we don't need a backup plan for biodiversity. So that's the stressful and depressing part. So absolutely excellent resources. I hope no one's like hiding in the closet crying at this point. I promise you, this gets better through the presentation. Predictions for the Mid-Atlantic area specifically from the U.S. Forest Service. The U.S. Forest Service, the Maryland Forest Service, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, just the Nature Conservancy. A number of organizations out there are just doing stunning, high-quality work with respect to biodiversity and climate change. And I just want to give them a giant shout out. So this is one of their reports, and they're talking about the natural communities of the Mid-Atlantic. And the most vulnerable communities are pretty much what you probably would expect. We have boreal forest remnant communities in the Appalachian Mountains. Many of you probably familiar with that. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And we also have a lot of plant communities around the perimeter of the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries, and those are vulnerable for multiple reasons, as you'll see in a minute. On the upside, some of my favorite plant communities are probably going to do well, and those are essentially native meadows. So we could have a strength in our native meadow communities here. We can expect, especially in the Piedmont, which has a transitional oak pine, oak hickory type of suite of forest communities, we can expect to see more of the species on the left. We can expect to see more post oak, more scarlet oak, and more southern red oak. We can expect to see less of American beech. And I was surprised by that because these days it seems like we just see more and more of American beech. But less of American beech. They consider it vulnerable because it is a mesic species that is not going to appreciate the extended hot droughts. Hot droughts. You know things aren't going well when people keep talking about hot droughts. So not just droughts, but hot droughts. And of course, you may have heard recently that we now have beech leaf disease in something like half of the counties in Maryland, rather well distributed across the state. So it looks like American beech is well, let's hope it's going to do better than it sounds like right at this moment. That does happen. So native plant populations. Like I said, so just reading like a massive number of papers, and I found that there were 5 different possibilities that were discussed as to how plant populations, and for those of you that don't know a lot of plant ecology lingo. Sometimes plant ecologists don't use well, any group of scientists, I'm not picking on them, but they don't use words to mean exactly what they mean in normal conversation. So a population is just a group of plants that, are probably cross-pollinating somewhere. You could think out in a particular forest patch, maybe all of the May-apples are cross-pollinating, something like that. So that would be a population of May-apples. So how will populations of native plants respond to climate change? And one of the things I've seen is that the populations may be plastic enough. And in this day and age, when you say plastic enough, it just sounds like like a bad thing, right? Is it like microplastics? What are we talking about here? But in this context, what they mean is that they may already have enough range within their DNA to handle this additional 5 to 10 degrees. I'm hoping for 5, but the anticipated warming with a few hot droughts thrown in there for good measure. So a lot of our species probably can take that. So they're plastic enough. The second thing they talk about is, well, maybe some of these plant populations will adapt. And again, adapt in the ecological sense. So adaptation requires genetic diversity. And it is one of the reasons that some of us in the native plant community are always saying, buy supplies of locally native plants, because that diversity is critically important, and climate change is the situation, right, of the moment that we need that diversity for. So natural selection, which is the process through which plants adapt, natural selection acts on that genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is like the grist for the mill. You can't have natural selection, you can't have adaptation without that grist. So trees in particular that take several years to reach reproductive maturity. So like an oak, it could be 30 years. Trees are going to adapt and migrate also. 30 years, right, before you produce a seed. They're going to adapt and migrate more slowly than most annual and perennial species will. Now, the U.S. Forest Service, again, fantastic resources. They have this climate change tree atlas that you see, just an example map on the right for sugar maple. And it's got like 200 tree species in it and 100 songbird species in it. And you can go and you can click on these maps and see where geographically do the best available models, and they're keeping this pretty current, the best available models show will be adapted for those species. So that's what that QR code is about. So migrate is the third thing, and some species will be able to migrate in a plant migrate sense of the word. So plants migrate by dispersing their seeds, and they typically disperse seeds in all directions, sort of a random pattern. And in the future, seeds that happen to be dispersed to the north will probably statistically outperform seeds that happen to be dispersed to the south, or uphill versus downhill, whatever the relevant case may be. So plants might migrate. Something that was mentioned also is just persisting, but at lower levels. And so we may begin to see that Some plant species are less abundant than they used to be. And this might be a sign that they are not adapting in real time. And this was mentioned specifically in the Maryland Forest Service State of the Forest 2020 report, which again, just an excellent resource. So we may see that it could be that what is happening is that the seedlings can no longer survive. So the mature tree could live for another 100 years, and you'll think, well, we still have, this kind of oak or what have you in the forest. It's fine, but in fact, they're no longer producing the next generation. And then we have local extinction. And that's going to happen. Some species just aren't going to be able to deal with all this change. So let's look at the first two, plastic and adaptation. I love common milkweed, and that's why I titled the slide Adapt Like a Boss, because this particular common milkweed is growing in the city in between parking lot asphalt and sidewalk concrete. And it really represents the city. This is DC. And it's like 10 degrees Fahrenheit hotter in the city in the summer than it is in the surrounding suburbs. And in some places in the city, it can be a lot more than 10 degrees. Probably a spot like this is a lot more than 10 degrees hotter. And yet the city native plants have adapted to all of the climate change that has occurred so far. So that 2.5 degrees that I mentioned that we're all in for, plus this 10 plus degrees Fahrenheit due to the urban heat island. That happens to be as much as the warming that is expected to occur by the end of this century in the worst case emissions scenario. And there's common milkweed doing it already. And not only that, it's just within decades. So very quickly, some species are going to be able to do this. So I find cause for hope, and there are many species in the city that are doing this. I find a lot of cause for hope there, and I really wish that we had the resources to wild collect and seed bank some of these seeds now so that they would be available for the cities, but also for the suburbs in the decades to come. So with the milkweed, I mentioned adaptation, but it is also possible that with that species, that it might be plasticity. So it might not be that they're evolving in response to climate change. It might literally just be that they were already that way. And other changes are allowing them to expand. They're actually, they're doing great. Migration is the third thing that was on that list, and plant populations that are surrounded by unsuitable habitat are more likely to experience a local extinction as a result of climate change. So examples of that occur in our region include mountain species and island species. And so we're going to look at examples of both of those. Plant species in Maryland's mountainous regions will find cooler summer temperatures if they go up to higher elevations, but species that are already at the top may not have anywhere else to go. Species adapted to mountaintop conditions are therefore more likely to experience local extinction. So the movement of species as the result of glacial advance and retreat is impeded in some parts of the world that have mountain ranges, like we have the Appalachians here, but they have mountain ranges that have an east-west orientation. and that blocks this south to north movement. We're fortunate, at least, to count our blessings that that is not an obstacle here. There's a 1997 article by Patelka and others, just an excellent writing style for a scientist, I have to say. It was pretty good writing style. And they examined the question of whether glacial retreat can occur quickly enough for species to escape climate warming. And their estimate of the rate of migration that occurred during the last glacial retreat was 1 kilometer per year. So again, for those of you that don't speak metric, that's less than a mile per year. That is not going to do the job for the situation that we're in right now. But they point out that just because that is how fast the species moved in the last glacial retreat, that doesn't actually mean that's as fast as they can move. That just means that's as fast as they needed to move. So they also, for an insight on this issue, and Judy, you're going to love this. Judy and Jill, you're both going to love this. They looked at the rate at which invasive plant species move. And invasive plant species move pretty damn fast. So there may be some hope in that. They give the example in their paper of cheatgrass, which expanded from 5 locations in 1880 to cover an absolutely huge area in between the Sierra and Rocky Mountains by 1930. So it was just extremely quick. And I can say from my own work with the National Capital PRISM, where we're doing early detection and rapid response, that a species will show up in New York City, can be here within 10 years. So that's 200 miles in about 10 years. Now, of course, people have somewhat accelerated the movement of plant materials, even when they don't mean to. So, you know, up until this point, that has just been a massive pain in the butt. But maybe that could work to our advantage for a change. All right. Now, so migration, we don't know if the plants can do that on their own or not. Probably some of them won't need to. Probably some of them can, but some of them may need some help. And that's where assisted migration comes in. And the images here are from an article that is very clearly and concisely written, where plant ecologists are writing to an audience of more general conservation biologists. So I think most of you would be able to understand this. So that's why I picked this one for a link. Plant populations, or even species that are adapted to very specific conditions, as many imperiled plant species are, may be surrounded, like the species over here in the left 2 drawings, by unsuitable growing conditions. So those green blobs represent the suitable growing conditions. And you need to migrate to suitable growing conditions, right? So they can't migrate successfully if they're confined in that way. Now, where resources allow, plant ecologists work to relocate endangered plant species to places that are projected by climate models to have the appropriate growing conditions in the future. So this process, it's called assisted migration, and it is only undertaken after, I kind of emphasize this, I am not encouraging people to go out and do this. I discourage people from going out and doing this. This is only done after careful study of any potential hazards. For example, relocated species could carry plant pathogens or insects that could interact in the new environment in completely unpredictable ways. And they could hybridize with related species. They could become invasive in those new locations themselves. So really, we need research teams. We desperately need research teams if we're actually going to do this, and natural resources staff to guide us all in this effort. So how does this play out in a tidal habitat? With respect to migration, there are topographic similarities between the situation that I just described in the mountains and the situation along the coastline of the Chesapeake Bay. With rising sea levels, plant populations might migrate uphill. In other words, offspring disperse uphill, and if it's not too wet or too salty up there, they will have a higher chance of survival than offspring that happen to disperse downhill. But like the mountain plants, in some situations, there just is no uphill to go to. So with the coastal forests, especially with coastal forests that are on islands or peninsulas, sometimes there is no uphill. Storms are also playing a pivotal role in this context because they increase the height of the tide, and they also cause salt water to move inland further normally than it normally would, which is damaging to the forest and just predisposes it for the situation you see here. So it's a double whammy for these maritime forests. So in this photograph of the maritime forest natural community, which is what it's called, you can see the trees in the foreground and that they're dying. And that's why the common phrase to describe this type of forest is ghost forest, because they're dead, but they're still there. And do you also see back here under the trees? Do you see these tall grasses? Well, that's Phragmites. And research has shown that Phragmites gets a foothold on the forest floor in these natural communities before the trees are dead. In fact, at 87% canopy cover, they've found that the Phragmites rhizomes are already in there. And when the trees fully lose their canopy, the Phragmites is already in there and fully grown, which means that the natural community that would normally occur with the rising sea level would be, depending on the exact situation, of freshwater, tidal marsh, or a high marsh. And that's not happening. It's literally getting preempted by the Phragmites. Another situation that happens, with the maritime forest, is that sometimes they could migrate uphill. In other words, there is a slope. It's not an island. There is a slope that goes uphill, but the thing that is uphill on that slope prevents them from advancing, like a seawall or a parking lot or a farm field. So at this point in my reading, I was thinking, I was discouraged at the loss of the forest, but I was thinking the carbon emissions from all of these trees that are just standing there and they're decaying, and that this is like the absolute worst time to be having just acres and acres of forest turning into carbon emissions. But as it turns out, one of the researchers looked into this, and they found out, at least in the cases where there is an uphill, So the forest continues on up the slope. The accelerated growth of the upslope forest by good access to fresh water and the high CO2 concentrations can accelerate plant growth. That good accelerated forest growth can actually more than compensate for the carbon loss. So not as bad as I thought it was at first when I read it. All right. If you're particularly interested in this topic, these researchers, Kate Tully and Matt Kirwan, you can Google on their names, Google ghost forests, and their names, and you will get, they have all kinds of good content out there, not just strictly speaking scientific publications, but content for the general public. And then the link at the far right is actually a piece they did on CBS Mornings news show, and it's a really good piece. I think you will enjoy that. And both Kate Tully and Matt Kirwan in their research are discussing the possibility of getting those habitats to transition into healthy marshes instead of, just Phragmites. So still over on the eastern shore, but now in the water instead of next to the water. Our first example of native plants that are shifting range in response to climate change comes from the Chesapeake Bay. Climate change is a contributing factor to the water temperatures, which are heating up, but so is urbanization. And so the hot water hitting the asphalt and the pavement and so forth, and just running into the streams and into the bay is heating up the bay. So hooray for all the rain gardens and those stormwater best management practices. And there's a great article that discusses this, which you can find at the link. But basically what is happening here is that the majority of the seagrasses, they call them, and they're not grasses. The majority of the seagrasses were eel grasses in the bay. And now the widgeon grass is moving in, it's moving south. And that's good news because the eel grasses are dying. And so at least it won't be barren meadows. But it is a change, and they do support different natural communities. But it is a range shift for the dense populations of widgeon grass. Actual widgeon grass communities are moving in to take up that space. Okay, so red spruce in the mountains. Pretty cool stuff. Red spruce can be found in the Appalachians as far south as North Carolina. This species range advanced northward after the last glacial retreat. When European settlers arrived in North America and they found all these beautiful big old red spruces, they started logging them because they're great for all kinds of things with respect to timber, unfortunately. And they took an estimated 90 to 95% of the red spruce acreage. Subsequent to that, in the 1900s, we had an acid rain problem, which further devastated the existing stands of red spruce. Now, acid rain is interesting. I didn't pick red spruce to tell this story because of the acid rain at all, but it happens to be another climatic situation that was caused by excess burning of fossil fuels. And by all accounts, from what I've seen in the literature so far, this is widely regarded as a situation that humanity has turned around. And so there's some hope in that too. But back to the spruce. In order for this species to adapt, the plant populations have to contain, again, good genetic diversity. And so that we can have the natural selection, and red spruce would need genetically diverse populations and corridors to migrate in. And after all of the logging and the acid rain damage, neither of those things was true. In fact, the remaining red spruce populations, many of them were so small and so inbred that they no longer produced successful offspring. And so the really good news here is that a coalition has formed. It includes the Nature Conservancy, several federal and state agencies, and they are doing genetically diverse wild seed collections in the red spruce areas that still contain genetic diversity. And they are growing the spruce and they are planting them out and they are building these corridors. And the other good news about this is that they're not doing just a species focus. They're actually trying to do this for the whole natural community. So the hardwood species, the forbs on the ground, and just give this community the space and the genetic diversity that it needs to survive at least some climate change. This is not called assisted migration. This is called assisted gene flow. Oh, and I wanted to say, look, I know I've been a little bit of a bummer, and I'm really sorry about that. But if you haven't checked out any of the other QR codes, check out these QR codes because this is a really good, wonderful, heartwarming story that's actually big enough to make a difference. And I think it will help you envision possible ways forward and give you some hope. So I really encourage you. I am going to go reread all of that again. And there's videos there too. So I think you will enjoy that. And more in good news, the Nature Conservancy is buying up migration corridors in the Appalachians, in the Central Appalachians. So down here, our latitude and lower, and they're buying up plots specifically to connect these corridors. And they have all three pillars of the sustainability model in this. Financial, so they've got carbon trading credits. They are leasing out logging permits, but logging permits in a way that the local community will be able to come in and harvest trees using a method that actually increases biodiversity and increases carbon sequestration. Yeah, it's just, and biodiversity. So I am really gobsmacked and encouraged by this program as well. And so far, they have purchased an area 7 times the area of Washington, D.C. So this is not a trivial accomplishment. This is big. This is important. So in conclusion, if you have ideas about what the heck we're going to do to get ourselves out of this situation with some biodiversity intact, I would love it if you would put it in the chat. I have 3 ideas that I have picked up from the literature, and they are number one, more land conservation. For natural adaptation to occur, the plants have to be out there, they have to be reproducing. They obviously have to have land to do that on. And so there is a global effort to get 30% of land in conservation by the year 2030. So it's called 30 by 30. And that is what that QR code will take you to if you want to read about that effort in the United States. Better land management. We could have more land, but if we're just going to let it be overrun by invasives and white-tailed deer, then the native plants aren't out there reproducing. If they're not reproducing, they can't adapt, right? And then finally, we need the type of scientists that actually do the work that I was describing with the red spruce, and those people are called plant ecologists. And I know of one, maybe two in the state of Maryland. We need a team. If we're gonna do this, those are the people we need. We need a team of them. And they're gonna need things. They're gonna need to do common garden studies, which is a whole topic on itself. And they're gonna need seed banks. So those are my 3 big ideas. And I hope a few of you put a few good ideas in the chat for me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really great and very stimulating. We've had a lot of good questions coming in.
Oh, cool.
Maryland meadows are relics of the hypsothermal, which is a warm period, and it's post-Pleistocene, but it's like 9,000 years ago. And so are there like qualities and things that help, and a list of those kinds of meadow plants that we can be looking at and their adaptations if we're going to be more droughty, but episodic rain deluges, seasonal variabilities, extremes, and then this warming. That was
Yeah,
my question.
Ron, I think you're right on target. And so just my personal opinion, like my best guess of what is going to happen to a lot of our forest is that they will become woodlands and meadows. So the species that you might see in an old field meadow, and we have, old field meadows, again, in my opinion, are grossly underrated in terms of their biodiversity contributions. And so we're going to see things like the local asters, the local milkweeds, the sedges, the rushes, mist flower, just all manner of really incredible things with locally native shrubs and their arrowwoods, winterberries, just, I mean, it goes on. I think this is a fantastic community. Yeah, thank you for asking that, Fawn. It's a really important point.
Thank you.
We have a comment from Monica Berger, a quote from Kurt Vonnegut. "Will go down in history as the first society that wouldn't save itself because it wasn't cost effective."
Kurt, thank you. I was trying to figure out how to get some humor into this presentation.
Another comment from Greg Peterson. "There's an irony over our oceans. We have reduced seagoing vessel emissions, which is great news, but unfortunately the lack of particulate matter for cloud formation clears the skies and makes it so there's not enough solar radiation screening, and that accelerates the heating of the ocean."
We did a good thing and we're being punished for it.
I saw it really quick. I saw it today on Pattern, that weather.com channel that on Verizon at 612. And they were talking about this process where they would shoot, I forget what it was, shoot particles up to create clouds for cooling off reefs and stuff like that. I mean, it was really interesting. They're trying to come up with very interesting new ideas.
So we have a question from Corrine Irwin. I would be interested to hear Sarah's thoughts on maintaining local ecotype native species versus assisted migration with the same native species from more southern areas.
Hi, Corinne. I hope you're doing well. It's nice to hear from you. So assisted migration in the examples that I've read that are actually happening are of the same species and within, so far what I'm reading, within that species natural range. My opinion on that, because you know I love a good locally native plant, right? And a local ecotype, but my opinion on that is that whatever the science indicates. And there is a community of scientists who have been publishing on local ecotypes and plant population genetics for years. And they are talking about assisted gene flow and assisted migration where the models indicate that it's absolutely necessary. But the consensus so far seems to be that the platinum approach is to conserve more land, to keep that land in good condition. They call this resiliency, so that the species have an opportunity to adapt and migrate themselves. I guess one of my biggest concerns is that the general public, and I empathize with the general public in this regard. I'm not trying to be critical. The general public is going to hear us talking about assisted gene flow or assisted migration, and they're going to attempt it themselves out of frustration. And I share the frustration. Where are the scientists? Where are the people who work with the scientists that we need right now to tell us, to help us develop a path forward where we don't have a plan? And it's incredibly frustrating. And I can empathize with the person who's probably down in Florida right now digging up a saw palmetto, throwing it in the back of the F-150 and driving it up to Maryland. And the disadvantage to that is plant pathogens, pests, invasive plant seeds, right? Jumping worms, anything could be in that root ball.
And ecotypes, the whole principle of ecotypes, bringing
Yep.
something from Florida. It's
Oh,
not
good
native to
Lord.
Maryland, so.
Yeah, so I'm concerned about it, but my short answer is I would follow the science.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi, Sarah. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
The question is, what is the difference between woodlands and forests? You had said that forests are going to be going, and I'm like, wait, what is the difference?
I know, right? The names are really confusing. So a woodland is just more open. So it's not total canopy closure. So it's so if you can imagine just a meadow with no trees and a forest with almost no herbaceous layer because it's so dark and shady in there, a woodland is in between.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Good to see you.
This is Judy Fulton. I'd like to add to what Sarah was saying about assisted migration. In many cases, people just look at the species and they try and relocate the species to, say, Maryland, but that doesn't consider that there may be a different subspecies in Florida or Minnesota or wherever, or a different variety.
Right.
And so that can really, really make it so that we are destroying the local ecotypes, if we bring those varieties and those subspecies in, and then they pollinate with the local plants. So that's another issue besides bringing in hitchhikers.
Yeah.
And also to build on what Sarah was saying, if you preserve large areas, then there can be a lot more diversity in the genetics of this Maryland species. And some of the resulting plants won't deal with climate change well at all, and they'll disappear. But if there's enough diversity there, then there will be in large groups of individuals who genetically are disposed to deal better with climate change.
Yes, and I would add on to that, absolutely. And Linda Keenan, hi Linda, put a comment in the chat. Fungal networks. The fungal networks could be different between those and the ecotypes or varieties that Judy is talking about literally evolved in response to climate. So that's the genetic diversity that we want to preserve to deal with this situation. And the scientists who specialize in this type of thing can sample that, see literally within the genome of the species which genes are changing in response to temperature and precipitation. And we didn't even talk about latitude, because you know what else varies with latitude is the amount of daylight. And plants have co-evolved with the amount of daylight at their latitude. And there's so like everything about this has nuances, which I am barely intelligent enough to read and understand enough of to re-articulate fairly poorly. We really need the right kind of scientists to be in our community helping us with this.
Okay, thank you. On to Grayson.
My question that I wanted to ask is what we can do. I mean, I don't know about everybody in this chat, but I know there are definitely a lot of us who are in Baltimore or maybe in DC. And I was just curious what like we urban foresters or like community members who are a part of an urban community that care about trees or just care about plants in general can do to like assist with this assisted migration. Like, are there certain trees that we could be planting more of in our cities, and like which ones I guess like can we advocate for to people like Tree Baltimore or like the tree keepers, because I know a lot of people are involved in that world and like trying to reforest Baltimore's urban canopy.
Yeah.
And we actually had a similar question from Lori in the chat, more about what are the best trees to plant now in Maryland that will tolerate climate change. So maybe we can do kind of a two-parter here.
Right. So the tree question is a really good question, because right now in Maryland, if you're planting a perennial plant or even a shrub, your best bet is still a local ecotype. But a tree, usually when you plant a tree, you want that to live for 100 years, right? You maybe plant the tree for yourself, but you're really planting it for decades down the road. That U.S. Forest Service climate change tree atlas, you can Google on that phrase. Or if you caught the QR code in the slide presentation, you can use that. It is absolutely fantastic resource, and they keep updating it. Which is really important, because some of the answers I used to teach the master gardeners and the master naturalists, and I would show them these sugar maple maps, And the sugar maple, you could just see like we were going to lose sugar maple over a lot of, or even all of Maryland. And they've completely revised that. They are now thinking that sugar maple loss is not going to be that bad. So they have new information, they update the maps. But when you go to this climate tree atlas and you enter the name of the species you want to know if that kind of tree will be good, they will say in the description whether or not it's a good whether it's a good street tree. And so for some of them, they'll say this is going to make a great, and part of that is the fact that as a street tree, it's going to take more temperature than your latitude would suggest, right? So I think you have a great resource. Are you an urban forester?
I am an urban forester. I'm a Baltimore tree keeper, so I'm sort of on the volunteer squad, but I don't actually live in Baltimore anymore. I'm in New York. I just really enjoy these programs.
Wow.
And I know plenty of people who are still in the tree keeper world, and I would love to pass on some resources to them too.
Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you for your volunteer service.
Oh yeah, no problem. Now I'm in New York. I'm a steward at the North Salem Open Land Foundation. So I'm still working with trees, just in a different place.
Cool.
All right. Thank you so much. It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I just
Thank
wanted to say
you.
that.
Thanks, Grayson. Okay, Ken, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, great presentation, Sarah. I'll just say
Oh,
a few
thank
words
you.
about stream restorations, which is my hot topic. And I say restorations in quote because it kind of ties into this whole topic of that we're talking about. For people who don't know what stream restorations are, it's really a misnomer. I have to say one thing that really kind of ticks me off a little bit is when someone made a point, made a comment in the chat, and if you're if you're a member of the industry that are doing these projects for money, you really need to clearly identify yourself as being an employee of a stream restoration company, so we know where you're coming from. So having said that, these stream restoration projects, they supposedly are trying to recreate a pre-colonial condition in an existing stream. And these are really done to meet our MS4 permits in our urban and suburban areas, which are EPA mandates to decrease the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment coming from urban areas. But these projects are going into really the last quote unquote natural areas we have in a lot of our suburban and urban areas. And I understand these are not pristine areas. I mean, nothing in the East Coast is pristine anymore, right? But the way the industry presents them is they're going to go in and recreate a pre-colonial environment, and it's going to improve the stream and the riparian habitat. But quite the opposite happens. There are meta studies that have been done, and if you want to contact me, you can do it through the MNPS folks. There are meta studies done where Margaret Palmer did a meta study of more than 600 stream restoration projects. Robert Hildebrand, also with the University of Maryland, he looked at a fewer number of products, but there are a number of other studies. And the result is that these projects do not improve the stream biology. In fact, many cases they decrease it. They do not improve the stream water quality. And so when people say, yeah, a couple projects, if you work, that's fine. I believe that maybe the odd project will, but those are outliers. That's the way science works. 99% of the projects are bad, and someone says, well, but my project is good. Yeah, that's to be expected. But in any case, there are alternatives to doing this. And I should say, the reason why these projects are done is to decrease erosion in the streams. They don't work. They get blown out or washed out by future storms because you're not addressing the root cause of the problem, which is stormwater coming from impervious surfaces like roads, roofs, and parking lots. So anything you do in the stream, if you don't control the stormwater at its source, is a waste of money. And these projects in Montgomery County, I have examples all through the county. I have evidence, I mean, I have photographs I've taken of projects that are getting washed out. And then the county is going and spending millions of dollars to rebuild them. But the alternative is, and this ties into what Sarah was saying, is you control the stormwater and before it gets into the streams, rain gardens, bioretentions, permeable pavements, planting trees, and there are multiple, co-benefits. Like Sarah said, you keep the hot water out of the streams, which will prevent some sensitive aquatic organisms from even surviving. You recharge the stormwater, you recharge the groundwater, you decrease the urban heat island, you increase property values, and so on and so on. I'll cut it off there.
Thanks, Ken. Good points. Okay, Sarah, did you have any reply, or should we go on to Connie?
Yeah, all I could say is I work with, I haven't looked into that issue deeply, and that is simply because I work with several professionals who do, and they would all say what I just heard from Ken.
Yeah.
So I haven't felt the need to research that issue deeply. I see the question from Connie. Yes.
Yeah, go for it, Connie.
Yes, I live in Charles County. You can see, that's my backyard. You can see we're in the woods. We have a well, and we need to have a perk test done. And I just saw in the news that the water table's low and a property owner may want to wait until the water level is higher. And I didn't know, I just moved here a year and a half ago from Michigan. So
Okay.
I didn't know if that's because of the heat that's been here, or why is the water table low? I'm in Newburgh.
Okay, so I love Charles County, Maryland. Very, very fond of that area. And I do not know the answer to your question. I can think of some other possible explanations. So if I were you and I did not want to hire a consultant, I would ask the county soil and water conservation district or the
Okay.
county extension office.
Okay.
So
I
yeah,
became
those
a
are,
master gardener, so I know them.
hey, you know the extension office, yes. So
Yes.
go give them a call.
Okay.
If they can't help you with that question, they will know who can.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, good luck.
Thank you, Connie. Okay, Fawn, go ahead.
It's a really quick question for Dr. Sarah. There's been research that these plants that can have a pollinator that don't have the pollinator that they need, and a lot of our plants are pollinator specific, flower specific, that they're going for self-fertilization.
Yes.
And that's a very interesting thing, because then you reduce diversity. And I was thinking that that's kind of a side problem, that pollinators need to be taken into account too if you're going to move plants or try to
Yes, that's
accommodate
right.
the adaptations and changes. That's all. So
They could be completely
my
adapted
question.
to a different suite of pollinators in the South than that species would be up here. And I've also read research about what you're talking about with the a plant population that is adapted to a pollinator, and that pollinator becomes not available or less available, that within a few generations, that plant species, through natural selection, through that pressure, the individuals in that population who are capable of producing seed without the help of a pollinator, selfing individuals, are going to have more offspring to populate the next generation, and that population will become more of a self-pollinating population. So thank you, Fawn. That's a great example. When I hope maybe a few people picked up on the fact that I was repeating myself about genetic diversity and natural selection and adaptation. We cannot have adaptation. So in this situation Fawn's talking about, in that plant population, there are both plants that can produce seeds as a result of that pollinator visit, but there are also plants who can produce seeds without the pollinators visit. And because of that, that plant population will adapt and survive to a decrease in pollinator visits.
We had a question a while back in the chat from Mona Shearman. It's basically responding to the fact that we're, having these situations where southern growing conditions are migrating northwards. And she asks, is it time to start teaching xeriscaping?
Oh yeah, I think xeriscaping is excellent. The thing that I'm fiddling with in my front yard right now is a bed of frost aster, so Symphyiotrichum pilosum, right next to a bed of broom sedge. And they are right on the curb. So it's where the concrete and the asphalt meet. And I literally never water them just to be mean. So no matter how bad it gets, I'm like, oh, I want to see whether you live or not and what you look like. And they've been doing great for years. So yeah, I really think that xeriscaping and maybe pushing the edges of what we consider or normally see to be native plant landscaping. Sometimes the quotes are appropriate. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you again, Sarah. It was fabulous, very interesting, lots of great questions. Thanks for everybody that participated, because you all have the best questions.
Yeah.
A very educated group of people out there. I learn a lot from the questions. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Sarah, and great to see you. Great to see all of you. Have a good last day of January tomorrow, and we're almost halfway through winter. That's a good thing. Okay, take care. See you on the next Zoom.